There are certain truths about the English countryside that no amount of romantic poetry can disguise, and chief among them is this: when something foreign intrudes upon the ordered tranquility of a proper English estate, it inevitably brings trouble in its wake. I've always maintained that my friend Hercule Poirot possesses an almost supernatural ability to detect such intrusions, whether they manifest as a misplaced ornament in a drawing room or, as in the case I'm about to relate, a magnificent marble fountain that seemed to watch the proceedings at Greystone Manor with the calculating gaze of a Renaissance prince. The morning of September 18th, 1934, found us rattling through the Hampshire countryside in my Lagonda, bound for what Poirot had described as a consultation most urgent, to yet delicately phrased. The invitation had come from Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the widow of the late Sir Charles Ashworth, whose shipping fortune had built the imposing Georgian manor that now appeared through the morning mist like something from a Turner landscape. "You observe, Hastings," Poirot murmured, adjusting his tie with characteristic precision as we approached the circular drive, "how the English countryside arranges itself with such perfect propriety. The hedgerows, they know their place. The oak trees, they have stood in their appointed spots for centuries. Everything is as it should be, non." "Quite right," I agreed, though I wondered where this observation was leading. "And yet," he continued, his green eyes narrowing as we rounded the final curve, "in the center of this most English of settings, what do we find?" The answer lay before us in gleaming white marble, impossible to ignore. The fountain dominated the circular courtyard with an almost aggressive magnificence, its 3 tiers of carved figures rising toward the pale morning sky. Neptune commanded the uppermost level, his trident raised in eternal triumph, while around the basin's edge, a parade of dolphins and cherubs cavorted in marble perpetuity. Water cascaded in silver streams from tier to tier, creating a symphony of sound that seemed oddly out of place against the quiet dignity of the manor house. "Good Lord," I breathed. "It's rather overwhelming, isn't it?" "It is beautiful," Poirot said quietly, "but it is not English. It speaks of Italian villas and Mediterranean passions. It does not belong here, and things that do not belong, mon ami, they create tensions. They disturb the natural order. And when the natural order is disturbed," he shrugged eloquently. "Murder follows," I suggested, only half in jest. "Let us say, rather, that murder finds the ground already prepared for it." The gathering storm. We were received by Hartwell, the butler, whose demeanor suggested that he had been expecting us with something approaching relief. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with a sort of dignified bearing that spoke of decades in service to the great houses of England. Yet I detected an unusual tension in his manner as he took our coats. "Her ladyship is in the morning room, Monsieur Poirot," he informed us, his voice carefully neutral. "She asked that you be brought to her immediately upon arrival. The household is, that is to say, the circumstances are somewhat unusual this morning." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Unusual in what manner, Hartwell?" The butler hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There was an incident in the night, sir. Her ladyship will explain the particulars, but I should mention that the local constabulary has been notified. Inspector Morrison of the Hampshire Police is expected within the hour." As we followed Hartwell through the imposing entrance hall, with its portraits of stern-faced Ashworth ancestors and gleaming suits of armor, I caught Poirot's eye. His expression had sharpened with interest, and I recognized the signs. The little grey cells had begun their work. Lady Beatrice Ashworth awaited us in a cheerful morning room that overlooked the gardens. She was a woman of perhaps 55 years, handsome rather than beautiful, was with the sort of composed dignity that comes from a lifetime of managing both estates and people. Yet this morning, her composure showed definite cracks around the edges. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, rising to greet us, "I cannot express how grateful I am that you could come so quickly. I fear that what began as a family gathering has taken a most sinister turn. Madame, Poirot replied, bowing over her offered hand, your telegram spoke of urgent need, but few specifics. Perhaps you would enlighten us as to the nature of this crisis. Lady Ashworth gestured for us to be seated, then moved to the window that provided a clear view of the controversial fountain. It concerns my stepson, Mr. Vincent Ashworth. He was found dead this morning in the fountain basin. The words fell into the morning air like stones into still water. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his hands forming the familiar steeple beneath his chin. Found by whom and at what time? By Davies, the head gardener, at approximately 6 o'clock. Vincent was floating face down in the lower basin. Davies immediately summoned Dr. Pembroke, our family physician, who confirmed that Vincent was beyond help. The doctor believes he may have struck his head on the marble edge while falling, though. She paused, her composure wavering. Though you have reasons to doubt this conclusion, Poirot prompted gently. Vincent was not given to midnight strolls, Monsieur Poirot. He was a cautious man, particularly around water. He never learned to swim properly after a childhood accident. Moreover, he had been receiving threatening letters. This revelation caused Poirot to sit back slightly, his eyes glittering with interest. Threatening letters? Of what nature? Anonymous notes posted from London, warning him to abandon his claims or face the consequences. Vincent believed they related to his inheritance. His father's will has been the subject of considerable discussion within the family. And who comprises this family, madame? Lady Ashworth moved away from the window, her hands clasping and unclasping nervously. Besides myself and Vincent, there is his half-sister, Miss Celia Ashworth, aged 28. She resides here permanently, having never married. Then there is my nephew, Mr. Gerald Thornbury, aged 35, who manages the estate's business affairs. His wife, Mrs. Vivian Thornbury, aged 32, and their son Philip, who is 15. A household of considerable size, Poirot observed, and all were present last night. Yes, along with 3 guests, Mr. Marcus Delacroix, an art dealer from London who came to appraise some paintings, Miss Penelope Marsh, a friend of Celia's from their finishing school days, and Signor Antonio Rossini, the architect who designed and supervised the installation of the fountain. At the mention of the fountain's creator, Poirot's attention sharpened noticeably. This Signor Rossini, his presence here was planned? He arrived unexpectedly yesterday afternoon, claiming there were structural concerns with the fountain that required immediate attention. Vincent was displeased by this development. For what reason? Lady Ashworth's composure finally cracked entirely. Because Vincent had been attempting to have the fountain removed. He claimed it was an eyesore, as inappropriate for an English estate. But I suspect his real objection was financial. The fountain was purchased with estate funds that Vincent felt should have been preserved for his inheritance. The picture was beginning to form in my mind. A household full of tensions, a controversial centerpiece that symbolized deeper conflicts, and now a death that might or might not be accidental. It was precisely the sort of situation that seemed to magnetize trouble like iron filings to a lodestone. Madame, Poirot said, rising from his chair, I should like very much to examine the scene of this tragedy, and then to meet with the members of your household. But first, tell me, what was Vincent's frame of mind last evening? Was there any particular incident or conversation that might shed light on his state of mind? Lady Ashworth's expression grew troubled. There was a heated discussion at dinner regarding the fountain. Vincent announced his intention to have it dismantled immediately, despite the cost. Signor Rossini became quite agitated, claiming that such action would be vandalism. Gerald supported Vincent's position, while Celia argued for preservation. The conversation became unpleasant. And after dinner, Vincent retired early to his room, claiming a headache. He was seen by several household members going upstairs around 9 o'clock. His body was discovered 9 hours later in the fountain basin. Poirot nodded slowly, then moved to join Lady Ashworth at the window. The fountain continued its eternal performance, the water catching the strengthening sunlight in prismatic displays. Yet now it seemed less a thing of beauty than a silent witness to tragedy. The fountain, it draws the eye, does it not? Poirot murmured. So white, so prominent, like a stage upon which dramas must inevitably be played out. Vincent called it a monstrosity, Lady Ashworth said quietly. He claimed it would be the ruin of us all. Poirot turned from the window, his expression grave. Perhaps, madame, he was more prophetic than he knew. Come, Hastings, let us examine this fountain more closely. I suspect it has many secrets yet to reveal. As we prepared to venture out into the garden, where the morning sun now illuminated every detail of the controversial marble masterpiece, and I could not shake the feeling that we were about to embark upon one of Poirot's most challenging cases. The fountain stood waiting, beautiful and silent, keeping its secrets as only stone can do. But Hercule Poirot had never met a secret he could not eventually coax into the light. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and late roses as Poirot approached the marble fountain with the reverence of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. The water continued its eternal cascade, indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded in its embrace mere hours before. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, circling the lower basin where Vincent Ashworth's body had been discovered. "The water here is perhaps 18 inches deep, sufficient to drown an unconscious man, but hardly a mortal trap for one in possession of his faculties." I peered into the crystalline depths, noting how the morning light played across the smooth marble bottom. Dr. Pembroke suggested he struck his head while falling. Précisément, and yet Poirot's gloved finger traced the basin's pristine edge. Where is the evidence of such violent contact? The marble shows no crack, no stain, no indication of impact. Most curious, non? Before I could respond, footsteps announced the arrival of Dr. Pembroke himself, a portly gentleman whose medical bag swung purposefully at his side. "Monsieur Poirot, I presume?" The doctor's handshake was firm, his manner professionally cordial. "Lady Ashworth mentioned your involvement. A tragic business, this." "Indeed, doctor." "Your examination of the deceased. What did it reveal?" Pembroke's expression grew troubled. "Death occurred between midnight and 3 o'clock, based on body temperature and rigor mortis. There was water in the lungs, confirming drowning, but also a significant contusion at the base of the skull." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "At the base, you say? Not the front or side, where one might expect injury from falling forward into the basin?" "Precisely what troubled me. The positioning suggests he was struck from behind, or perhaps fell backward, most peculiar for an accidental drowning." The doctor paused meaningfully. His evening shoes were thoroughly soaked, but curiously, we found a pair of dry bedroom slippers near the fountain steps, as if he had changed footwear before. "Whatever occurred." Poirot's exclamation was soft but significant. "And his person? Was anything else discovered?" A folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket. "Lady Ashworth has it now. Some sort of note, I believe." After Dr. Pembroke departed, Poirot knelt to examine the flagstones surrounding the fountain. "See here, Hastings. The moss between the stones is disturbed, scuff marks that point away from the fountain, not toward it." He was leaving? Or being dragged? Poirot straightened, his gaze traveling upward to the fountain's ornate tiers. "And observe the middle level. That cherub holding the pitcher. It has been rotated slightly. In a structure of such precise symmetry, even 3 degrees of displacement screams for attention." Heavy footsteps crunched on gravel as a large man in tweeds approached, so his face flushed with official bluster. "Inspector Morrison," the newcomer announced, eyeing Poirot with suspicion. "I understand there's been some interference with my crime scene." "Assistance, Inspector," Poirot corrected with a polite bow. I'm Hercule Poirot, Morrison huffed dismissively. Well, it's straightforward enough. Accidental death, slipped on wet stones, struck his head, drowned. Tragic, but hardly mysterious. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Then perhaps, Inspector, you can explain why a man who changed from soaked evening shoes to dry slippers would then venture back to the very fountain he had apparently just fled? Inspector Morrison's face reddened at Poirot's pointed observation about the slippers, but before he could muster a suitable retort, Lady Ashworth appeared at the terrace doors. "Ah, the household is assembled in the drawing-room, Monsieur Poirot," she announced, her voice carefully controlled. "Inspector Morrison, you are naturally welcome to join us." The drawing-room of Greystone Manor presented a study in barely contained tensions. Persian carpets muffled our footsteps as we entered, while ancestral portraits gazed down with expressions that seemed to mirror the current occupant's wariness. The French windows provided an unobstructed view of the controversial fountain, its marble figures gleaming mockingly in the morning sun. Miss Celia Ashworth stood by the fireplace, her slender frame rigid with suppressed emotion. At 28, she possessed the pale, sensitive features of one who felt life's blows too keenly. Her hands twisted a lace handkerchief with methodical precision. Mr. Gerald Thornbury lounged near the window with studied casualness, though I noted his fingers drummed a nervous rhythm against his thigh. Tall and athletic, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, yet something in his manner suggested that confidence was currently under siege. His wife, Vivian, occupied a silk-upholstered chair, her fashionable dress and carefully arranged blonde hair presenting a picture of studied elegance. Her blue eyes, however, moved constantly, cataloguing every gesture and expression with predatory alertness. Signor Antonio Rossini paced before the mantelpiece with theatrical agitation, his Mediterranean features animated by barely controlled emotion. The Italian architect's expensive suit and dramatic bearing suggested a man who viewed life as perpetual performance. Mr. Marcus Delacroix, the art dealer, stood apart, his refined features arranged in professional neutrality, while Miss Penelope Marsh perched nervously on the sofa's edge, clutching a small notebook like a talisman. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the tension-charged atmosphere. "I understand last evening's dinner concluded with heated discussion regarding the fountain's future." Vincent was being completely unreasonable, Gerald interjected, his tone sharp. He wanted to destroy a work of art simply because he considered it financially imprudent. "And where were you, Monsieur Thornbury, when Vincent retired at 9 o'clock? "In my study, reviewing estate accounts until midnight." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Yet you observed Vincent ascending the staircase." "The study door. It faces away from the main stairs, does it not?" Gerald's confident demeanor faltered visibly. The door was slightly ajar. I happened to glance out." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "And at what time did you see him return downstairs?" "I didn't. I assumed he remained in his room." "Most curious, for I have discovered something most interesting in Vincent's effects, a jeweler's receipt dated yesterday for an onyx and silver bracelet." Poirot's gaze swept the room. "Yet I observe, Miss Celia, that you wear such a bracelet this very morning." Celia's composure shattered entirely. "He wasn't going to give it to me," she cried, pointing a trembling finger across the room. "It was meant for her, for Vivian." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, while outside, the fountain continued its eternal, mocking song. Miss Vivian Thornbury rose from her chair with glacial composure, though I observed the slightest tremor in her carefully manicured fingers. "How dare you suggest such a thing, Celia?" she said, her voice carrying the chill of winter morning. "Your brother's affections toward me were entirely proper, those of a concerned family member, nothing more." "Were they?" Celia's voice broke with suppressed emotion. "I saw you together in the conservatory 3 evenings past. his hand upon your shoulder, whispering secrets while your own husband labored late in his study. And now this bracelet, purchased for you, not me. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Gerald Thornbury's confident demeanor crumbled visibly, his face cycling through expressions of shock, hurt, and dawning comprehension. "Vivian," he said quietly, "is this true?" Vincent was consoling me about Mother's declining health. Vivian replied, though her grip on the chair's arm betrayed white-knuckled tension. Nothing more occurred than conversation between relations. Poirot stepped forward, his green eyes moving between the married couple with the precision of a jeweler examining facets of a diamond. "Monsieur Thornbury, perhaps now we understand why your study door was positioned slightly ajar. Not to observe Vincent's movements, but to monitor your wife's." Gerald slumped against the window frame, years of suppressed suspicion finally finding voice. "I suspected something. Vincent had a way of acquiring things. First the estate funds for that damned fountain, then my authority over business matters, and then—" He gestured helplessly toward his wife. "Then your affections as well," Poirot suggested gently. "I didn't kill him." Gerald's denial exploded from him with desperate force. "Yes, I went to the garden around 10 o'clock, intending confrontation, but I never found him there." "Yet you observed someone else, perhaps?" Gerald's eyes darted toward Signor Rossini, who had been following the exchange with mounting agitation. "I saw Rossini at the fountain, working at something in the darkness with tools." "Madonna mia!" Rossini burst forth with theatrical indignation. "Lies and calumny. I was in my chambers, sketching by lamplight. The artistic spirit knows no schedule for inspiration." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "And yet, Signor, so the cherub on the fountain's middle tier has been rotated from its original position, a task requiring both tools and considerable effort." Before Rossini could formulate a response, Poirot turned his attention to Vivian with renewed focus. "Madame Thornbury, I observe that your evening gloves, which rest upon the side table, show distinct water stains at the cuffs. Most curious for a lady who claims to have remained indoors." Vivian's composure finally showed cracks. I did venture to the fountain last night, around 11 o'clock. The sound of falling water usually calms my nerves when sleep proves elusive." "And did you encounter Vincent during this nocturnal visit?" "No. The courtyard appeared entirely empty. I remained perhaps 10 minutes before returning to my chambers." Inspector Morrison stepped forward, and his expression suggesting he believed the case was crystallizing. "So we have Gerald with motive and opportunity, Rossini tampering with the fountain mechanism, and Mrs. Thornbury admitting to being at the scene. This is becoming clearer." "One moment, Inspector." Poirot raised his hand in gentle restraint. "We must not overlook other testimony." He turned toward the pale young woman who had remained silent throughout the heated exchanges. "Miss Marsh, you mentioned hearing footsteps in the corridor at midnight. Can you provide more specific details?" Penelope Marsh started, clutching her small notebook like a shield. My room adjoins Vincent's, and I know his restless pacing when troubled. But last night, the footsteps passed his door entirely, high continuing toward the servants' staircase." "Those stairs provide direct access to the garden," Poirot observed thoughtfully. "Indeed they do," Lady Ashworth confirmed from her position near the door. Poirot's gaze swept the assembled company, his expression suggesting wheels turning within wheels. "We have established that multiple persons visited the fountain area last evening, some admittedly, others perhaps not. But before we proceed further, I believe we must examine that anonymous letter Vincent received. The truth, it often hides in the smallest details." The fountain continued its eternal song beyond the windows, beautiful and mocking, keeping its deadly secrets as only marble can. Lady Ashworth led us through the hushed corridors of Greystone Manor to Vincent's private chambers, her keys jangling softly against her chatelaine. But the room that greeted us spoke volumes about its late occupant's character, every surface arranged with mathematical precision, every object in its designated place with the rigid order of a man who found chaos intolerable. "Vincent was always particular about his surroundings," Lady Ashworth murmured, unlocking a mahogany escritoire near the window. "He said disorder in one's environment reflected disorder in one's thinking." Poirot moved about the room with reverent attention, his observant gaze cataloguing details that lesser minds might overlook. "Indeed, madame, this room, it tells us much about Monsieur Vincent's state of mind. See here, Hastings. The wardrobe arranged by color gradation, the books ordered by height rather than subject. This is not the chamber of a man preparing for death, is but of one expecting to continue his precise existence indefinitely." I noted the turned-down bed, the carefully brushed evening clothes draped over a chair, and most significantly, a pair of patent leather shoes whose dulled surface bore the unmistakable marks of dried water. "The shoes he wore during his first visit to the fountain," Poirot observed, lifting one to examine its condition. "Yet we found dry bedroom slippers near the fountain steps this morning. Therefore, between his initial encounter with the fountain's waters and his final, fatal visit, Vincent returned here to change his footwear. Most curious behavior for a man supposedly wandering the grounds in distress." Lady Ashworth retrieved a folded paper from the escritoire's locked drawer. The threatening letter found in his pocket. "Doctor, Pembroke returned it to me this morning." Poirot accepted the missive with characteristic delicacy, his fingers tracing the cheap paper's texture as his eyes absorbed every detail. Through his pince-nez, he examined the postmark, the handwriting, even the way the ink had absorbed into the paper's fibers. "Posted from London 3 days past," he murmured. The address written in block capitals, an obvious attempt at disguise. Yet observe, Hastings, how certain letters pressed deeply into the paper while others barely indent it. Someone unaccustomed to writing in capitals, perhaps struggling with emotion. He unfolded the note carefully and read aloud. "Abandon your claims, or the fountain will become your grave. You have been warned." Theatrical, I observed. Rather melodramatic for a genuine threat. "Précisément, mon ami. As this is not the language of professional criminality, but of someone who wishes to appear dangerous while lacking true malevolence. Notice the phrasing, 'the fountain will become your grave.' It appeals to imagination rather than stating direct intent. Most curious for a letter that Vincent took seriously enough to carry in his pocket." Inspector Morrison, who had been examining the room's other contents, looked up with skepticism. Perhaps he was meeting his correspondent at the fountain, walking into a trap. Then why change from wet shoes to dry slippers before venturing out again? Poirot countered. A man expecting danger does not pause for sartorial considerations. Before Morrison could respond, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor. Young Philip Thornbury burst through the doorway, his 15-year-old face flushed with excitement and discovery. "Monsieur Poirot, I found something in the garden, hidden beneath the hedge near the fountain steps." He held forth a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. "I was searching for my cricket ball when I noticed the hiding place." Poirot unwrapped the package with infinite care, revealing an ornate silver cigarette case, its surface elaborately engraved with the Ashworth family crest. Lady Ashworth's face drained of color as recognition dawned. "That belonged to my late husband, Sir Charles. It disappeared from his effects shortly after his funeral 5 years ago. I assumed it had been mislaid during the sorting of his possessions." Poirot opened the case with reverent attention. Instead of cigarettes, it contained a small brass key and a folded document, a yellowed with age and bearing the unmistakable letterhead of Pemberton and Associates, the family solicitors. "A letter from your late husband's legal representatives," Poirot observed, scanning the contents. "Dated 1 week before Sir Charles's death, it concerns certain irregularities in the management of estate funds. It appears Sir Charles had discovered unauthorized withdrawals from the fountain construction account. substantial sums that exceeded the agreed-upon budget by nearly 50%. The implications settled over the room like fog rolling in from the moors. Gerald Thornbury, who had followed his son upstairs, stood frozen in the doorway, his face cycling through expressions of shock and dawning comprehension. "Vincent managed those accounts," he said quietly. "Yeah, he oversaw all payments to contractors and suppliers." "Including payments to Signor Rossini," Poirot added meaningfully. "Yet this letter suggests Sir Charles intended to investigate these discrepancies upon his return from London. His sudden death from heart failure prevented that investigation." Lady Ashworth sank into a nearby chair, her composure finally cracking. "You're suggesting Vincent was embezzling from his own inheritance?" "I suggest nothing yet, madame, but this cigarette case was hidden deliberately, not lost. Someone knew of its contents and feared their discovery. The question becomes, was Vincent the embezzler, or had he recently discovered the true culprit's identity?" Poirot moved to the window, gazing down at the controversial fountain with its eternal cascade of water. The fountain. It becomes more significant with each revelation, not merely a work of art or a symbol of extravagance, but perhaps the centerpiece of a more complex deception. Inspector Morrison stepped forward, his expression suggesting the case was crystallizing in his mind. So Vincent was either a thief or had discovered one. Either way, someone had motive for murder. "Ah, but Inspector," Poirot replied, turning from the window with an enigmatic smile, "we have yet to determine which of our suspects possessed the key to this cigarette case's hiding place. For that knowledge, I suspect, will lead us directly to our murderer." Outside, the fountain sang its eternal song, beautiful and mocking, while the morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, where Vincent Ashworth had met his mysterious fate. The little grey cells were beginning to perceive the pattern hidden beneath the surface of events. But Poirot knew that patience and methodical investigation would be required to expose the full truth lurking in the depths of this deceptively tranquil English manor. Inspector Morrison positioned himself before the assembled household with the satisfied air of a man who believed he had solved the puzzle. His thick fingers drummed against his notebook as he surveyed the occupants of the drawing-room, his gaze settling with particular intensity upon Gerald Thornbury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with official gravity, "the discovery of Sir Charles's cigarette case has illuminated this matter considerably. We now understand that substantial funds were misappropriated from the fountain construction account. Vincent Ashworth, used as a state manager, either perpetrated this theft or had recently discovered the true culprit's identity." Gerald stood rigidly by the French windows, his knuckles white where they gripped the curtain fabric. "Inspector, surely you don't suggest—" "I suggest nothing, Mr. Thornbury. I state facts." Morrison's voice carried the weight of authority. "You possessed both motive and opportunity. Vincent threatened your marriage, your position, and potentially your inheritance. You admitted visiting the garden with intent to confront him. Most damning, you had access to your late uncle's effects and could easily have hidden that cigarette case." "This is preposterous," Lady Ashworth interjected, her voice trembling with indignation. "Gerald would never—" "Wouldn't he?" Morrison's interruption was sharp. "A man facing financial ruin, to marital humiliation, and criminal exposure. I've seen lesser motives drive men to murder." From his position near the window, Poirot had been observing this exchange with the detached interest of a naturalist studying specimens. Now he rose with characteristic precision, smoothing an imaginary crease from his waistcoat. "Inspector," he said mildly, "your theory possesses a certain symmetry. It sits comfortably in the mind, like a well-tailored suit, but I confess to certain psychological difficulties with your conclusions." Morrison's face reddened slightly. "Such as? Consider Vincent's behavior yesterday evening. Here is a man who, according to your theory, has been systematically embezzling from his father's estate. Yet at dinner, he announces his intention to have the fountain, the very symbol of his crime, demolished immediately. This is not the psychology of the guilty, Inspector. It is the behavior of one who has come to loathe what the fountain represents. Perhaps a guilty conscience finally surfaced, Morrison suggested stubbornly. Perhaps, Poirot conceded with elegant diplomacy. Or perhaps, conversely, the conscience of one who has discovered he has been made the scapegoat for another's crimes. A man falsely accused often becomes obsessed with destroying the evidence of his supposed guilt. Before Morrison could formulate a response, Poirot turned his attention to the Italian architect, who had been following the exchange with mounting agitation. "Signor Rossini," Poirot said gently, "you have remained remarkably silent during this discussion of financial irregularities. Yet as the fountain's creator, so surely you can shed light on these mysterious cost overruns." Rossini's theatrical composure began to crack under Poirot's steady gaze. His hands, which had gestured so dramatically earlier, now trembled as they gripped the mantelpiece. "The materials," he began weakly. "Carrara marble of such quality, it does not come cheaply. The hydraulic mechanisms required extensive. Yet Sir Charles's letter suggests he had obtained competing estimates," Poirot interrupted with silken precision. "Estimates that were substantially lower than your final accounting. Most illuminating, no?" The architect's resistance crumbled entirely. "Very well. Yes, there were irregularities in the billing, but it was not my idea. Vincent approached me when the project began, suggesting certain arrangements. He would approve inflated invoices. I would return a portion in cash. He claimed his father's allowance was insufficient for his needs. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Gerald's face reflected a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension, while Lady Ashworth sank deeper into her chair. "So Vincent was embezzling," Morrison said with satisfaction. "That confirms my theory entirely." "Attendes." Poirot raised a delicate hand. "Let us hear the complete story before drawing conclusions. Continue, signor." Rossini's voice grew stronger as confession provided relief. 3 months ago, Vincent contacted me in Rome. His manner had changed completely. He was no longer the charming conspirator, but a man consumed with fear and guilt. He had discovered that his father suspected the irregularities before his death. Vincent demanded I return the excess funds and agreed to dismantle the fountain to hide the evidence. "But you could not return money already spent," Poirot observed. "The funds had gone to settle gambling debts that would have ruined my career. I came here, hoping to negotiate, to convince Vincent of alternative arrangements, but he showed no mercy. 60 days to repay everything, or he would inform the authorities." "So you killed him," Morrison concluded triumphantly. "No." Rossini's denial exploded with desperate sincerity. "I argued with him, yes, but I did not kill him. I was at the fountain from 10:30 until nearly midnight, working to secure the rotated cherub mechanism. Vincent had threatened to damage it deliberately to create evidence of structural failure." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "And during this time, you observed nothing unusual?" "When I finished my work and prepared to return to the house, I heard Vincent's voice from the direction of the servants' staircase. He was speaking to someone, a woman, I am certain of this. His words were quite clear. 'I know what you've done, and tomorrow everyone else will know as well.'" This revelation electrified the room. Lady Ashworth, Miss Celia, Mrs. Vivian Thornbury, and Miss Penelope Marsh, any of them might have been Vincent's midnight interlocutor. "The time?" Poirot inquired with sharp attention. "Shortly before midnight. I heard rapid footsteps descending toward the garden as I climbed the main staircase. Vincent's tone was not angry, but triumphant, as though he held winning cards in a crucial game." Poirot moved to the French windows, gazing out at the fountain where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble figures. "So we discover that Vincent was not merely an embezzler, but a man who had recently awakened to the full extent of his father's suspicions. A man who had decided to expose not only his own crimes, but apparently some additional secret involving a woman of this household. He turned back to the room, his green eyes moving systematically from face to face. Vincent Ashworth, it seems, was a collector of secrets, a dangerous hobby for a man surrounded by people with much to lose. The fountain's eternal song drifted through the open windows, no longer merely beautiful, but somehow ominous, as though the marble figures themselves were whispering the secrets that had led to murder in their shadow. Inspector Morrison's confident theory lay in ruins, if replaced by a far more complex web of guilt, blackmail, and hidden motives that would require all of Poirot's legendary skills to untangle. The weight of Rossini's testimony settled over the drawing room like evening mist, transforming the assembled company into a tableau of barely concealed anxiety. 4 women, Lady Ashworth, Miss Celia, Mrs. Vivian Thornbury, and Miss Penelope Marsh, now found themselves under the penetrating gaze of suspicion, each aware that one among them had spoken with Vincent Ashworth in his final hour. Poirot moved with characteristic precision to the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back in the manner of a conductor preparing to guide a complex symphony. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with exquisite courtesy, "the revelation of this midnight conversation requires delicate handling. I propose to speak with each lady privately. It is more comfortable that way, n'est-ce pas?" Inspector Morrison's face reddened with official displeasure. "See here, Poirot, this is a murder investigation, not a tea party. We should question them together, under proper police procedure." "Ah, but Inspector," Poirot replied with gentle firmness, "the psychology of the guilty mind, it does not respond well to public examination. In private, the truth has room to breathe." The methodical approach. Lady Ashworth rose with dignified composure. "I shall go first, Monsieur Poirot. I have nothing to conceal." In the adjacent smoking room, she settled into a leather armchair, with the poise of one accustomed to difficult conversations. Poirot took the opposite seat, his manner respectful, yet penetrating. "Madame, did you encounter Vincent after he retired from dinner last evening?" "No. I retired shortly after 10, and remained in my chambers until Hartwell summoned me at dawn." Her answer came without hesitation, but Poirot noted the slight tension in her clasped hands. "You slept soundly throughout the night?" "I read until nearly midnight, then dozed fitfully. The fountain's sound, while usually soothing, seemed unusually loud last evening." "You heard no voices?" "No indication of activity in the garden." "None whatsoever." Lady Ashworth met his gaze steadily. "Vincent was troubled by many things, Monsieur Poirot, but I was not among them." When she departed, Miss Celia entered, her pale features drawn with suppressed emotion. The onyx bracelet gleamed darkly against her wrist as she twisted her handkerchief with nervous energy. "You believe it was me," she said immediately. "The woman Vincent spoke to at midnight." "I believe you are deeply troubled, mademoiselle. That is all I know with certainty." Celia's composure cracked like thin ice. "Very well. Yes, I met Vincent at the fountain last evening, but not at midnight. Earlier, around 11:30. He had sent a note to my room requesting the meeting." Poirot leaned forward with sharp attention. "And the subject of this conversation?" "Vincent had discovered something terrible about our father's death. Not the manner of it, but the circumstances surrounding it. He showed me correspondence that father had hidden in his private safe, letters that revealed—" She paused, struggling with the words. "Continuez, mademoiselle." "That father had discovered substantial embezzlement from the fountain construction funds, not by Vincent, as everyone assumed, but by someone else entirely. Vincent had been protecting the true culprit, but his conscience finally overcame his infatuation. And this true culprit?" Celia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Vivian. My brother-in-law's wife had been systematically diverting funds to cover gambling debts. Vincent discovered father's evidence after the funeral and chose to shield her rather than expose the family to scandal. But recently, she had begun demanding more, threatening to claim Vincent had forced her participation if he didn't continue providing money. The revelation struck Poirot with the force of illumination. So Vincent, the supposed embezzler, was actually the victim of blackmail. Yes, and last night he finally decided to end it, and he planned to present the evidence to Gerald this morning, regardless of the consequences to Vivian or the family reputation. And how did Vivian respond to this decision? I don't know. Vincent was alive when I left him at the fountain, agitated but determined. He said he intended to wait for her there, to give her one final chance to confess voluntarily. The physical evidence. As Celia departed, young Philip Thornbury appeared at the door, his face flushed with excitement. "Monsieur Poirot, I found something else in the garden, hidden beneath the ivy near the conservatory wall." He produced a small leather-bound diary, its pages damp from morning dew. "Vincent's private journal," Lady Ashworth identified immediately upon rejoining us. "He kept it locked in his desk drawer, and I noticed it was missing when we searched his room this morning." Poirot examined the volume with reverent attention, noting how the final entries showed increasingly agitated handwriting. "Listen to this passage from yesterday afternoon," he said, reading aloud. "The deception ends tonight. I have father's letters proving V's guilt, and I can no longer be her accomplice. At midnight by the fountain, I will give her the choice: confess to Gerald or face public exposure. Either way, I am done being her puppet." "V for Vivian," Inspector Morrison observed with satisfaction. "That settles the matter." "Perhaps," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "But observe this earlier entry from 3 days past. P grows more desperate in her correspondence. Her threats become increasingly wild. She claims to have evidence that would destroy me. But I suspect it is merely the hysteria of a woman facing exposure herself." "P?" I queried. Before Poirot could respond, Miss Penelope Marsh appeared in the doorway, her face deathly pale. I heard my initial mentioned. I suppose there's no point in further concealment." She entered the room with the resigned air of a condemned prisoner. "Yes, I had been corresponding with Vincent. Not romantic letters, as you might assume, but business correspondence. I had been helping him forge documents." The admission struck the room like a physical blow. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "What manner of documents, mademoiselle?" "Invoices, receipts, bank transfers. Anything needed to cover the trail of Vivian's embezzlement. Vincent convinced me it was to protect the family honor, that exposure would destroy Gerald and young Philip. Said I was skilled at such work from my father's accounting firm before his bankruptcy." "And your payment for these services?" "Vincent promised to help establish me as a novelist, to use his connections in London publishing, but recently he began demanding more than forgery. He wanted me to provide false testimony that would implicate Signor Rossini as the primary culprit." "Which you refused?" "Yes. And last night I went to the fountain to tell him I would no longer participate in his schemes. But when I arrived," she shuddered, "I heard voices. Vincent arguing with someone near the fountain's edge. Then there was a terrible splash and silence." "You saw nothing?" "The moon was behind clouds. I heard footsteps running toward the house, but I couldn't identify them, and I was too frightened to investigate further." The convergence of Truth Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the fountain where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble figures. "So we have established that Vincent met with both Miss Celia and Miss Marsh last evening and intended to confront Mrs. Thornbury at midnight. The question becomes, did that final confrontation occur, and what was its outcome?" Mrs. Vivian Thornbury chose that moment to enter the room, her composure intact despite the revelations swirling around her. "I believe you've been discussing me in my absence, Monsieur Poirot." "Indeed, madame. Perhaps you would care to provide your account of last evening's events." Her smile was brittle as winter ice. "Certainly. I met Vincent at the fountain as he requested. Not at midnight, but shortly before. He was quite agitated, making wild accusations about financial irregularities and demanding I confess to crimes I never committed. And your response? I told him he was mistaken, that his grief over his father's death had clouded his judgment. When he became increasingly hostile, I returned to the house. He was very much alive when I left him. Poirot's green eyes glittered with the light of revelation. Yet 3 witnesses placed different people at the fountain between 11:30 and midnight. Miss Celia, yourself, and Miss Marsh. Most curious timing for what should have been a private confrontation. Then perhaps, Vivian replied with icy precision, one of your witnesses is lying. The fountain's eternal song drifted through the open windows, beautiful and mocking, through as Poirot's little grey cells worked to untangle the web of truth from the strands of deception that bound this troubled household. The final revelation was drawing near, but like the approach of storm clouds on the horizon, it promised to bring destruction in its wake. The afternoon sun cast elongated shadows across the courtyard as Poirot stood before the controversial fountain, his keen eyes studying every detail of its marble construction. Inspector Morrison shuffled impatiently beside us, clearly eager to arrest someone, anyone, who might bring this perplexing case to a tidy conclusion. Signor Rossini, Poirot said suddenly, his voice carrying across the garden with quiet authority. I believe the time has come for complete honesty regarding your fountain's construction. There are certain features, that were not mentioned in your original testimony. The Italian architect emerged from the house with reluctant steps, his earlier theatrical composure replaced by the hunted expression of a man whose secrets were rapidly unraveling. Lady Ashworth and the other household members followed, drawn by some inexorable force to witness whatever revelation awaited. Monsieur Poirot, Rossini began weakly, I have told you everything of relevance. Have you? Poirot interrupted with uncharacteristic sharpness. Then perhaps you can explain why the cherub holding the pitcher, the very figure you claim to have been adjusting last evening, shows signs of repeated rotation over many months, not merely recent mechanical failure. Poirot approached the fountain's middle tier, his gloved fingers tracing the marble base of the cherub in question. Observe, Hastings, these scratches in the marble, worn smooth by frequent use. This is not the result of occasional maintenance, but of regular access to something concealed within. The architect's resistance crumbled visibly. Very well, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The cherub mechanism conceals a small waterproof compartment. It was Vincent's request. He wanted a romantic hiding place for private correspondence, something more adventurous than a conventional safe. The hidden chamber. Under Poirot's watchful eye, Rossini produced a small key from his waistcoat pocket. With practiced movements, he inserted it into what appeared to be merely decorative scrollwork at the cherub's base. A soft click echoed across the courtyard as the figure rotated smoothly, not revealing a cavity no larger than a jewelry box within the marble structure behind it. The compartment was empty. Yet it was not always so, Poirot observed, peering into the hollow space with his magnifying glass. See here, recent scratches on the interior walls and traces of what appears to be sealing wax. Documents were stored here, removed hastily and recently. Lady Ashworth stepped forward, her face pale with understanding. The papers Charles mentioned in his final letter, evidence of the financial irregularities. Vincent must have discovered them after the funeral. Précisément, madame. But observe this curious detail. Poirot withdrew his finger from the compartment, showing us a faint smear of fresh grease mixed with marble dust. Someone accessed this hiding place after Signor Rossini completed his mechanical adjustments last evening. Someone less careful, who left traces of their haste. The trail of evidence. Young Philip Thornbury chose that moment to appear around the corner of the house, his face flushed with excitement. Monsieur Poirot. Davies found something else while clearing the garden drains. It was caught in the grating near the kitchen garden. He produced a small object wrapped in his handkerchief, a fountain pen of expensive make, its gold barrel cracked and its nib bent beyond repair. Beside it lay fragments of paper, waterlogged but bearing the ghostly traces of handwriting. Poirot examined the pen with reverent attention. Waterman, gold-filled with Vincent's monogram engraved upon the clip. Yet see how it is damaged, not from a simple fall, but as though someone attempted to destroy it deliberately. "The papers?" I inquired. "Fragments only remain, yet they are suggestive." Through his pince-nez, Poirot studied the surviving scraps. "Here we see, cannot continue this deception. And father's evidence proves, written in Vincent's hand, yet never completed." Dr. Pembroke, who had arrived to check on Lady Ashworth's condition, leaned forward with professional interest. "The pen shows signs of having been gripped with considerable force. See these indentations in the barrel. Someone was writing under extreme emotional stress." "Or," Poirot suggested quietly, "someone was prevented from completing their task by an unexpected interruption." The psychological pattern. Inspector Morrison stepped forward with barely concealed impatience. "This is all very interesting, Poirot, but we have 3 people who admit to being at the fountain last evening, and at least 2 with clear motives for murder. Surely the physical evidence points to— Attendez, Inspector." Poirot raised a delicate hand. "Physical evidence must be interpreted through the lens of human psychology, or it becomes merely a collection of meaningless objects. Consider, Vincent changed from wet evening shoes to dry bedroom slippers before his final visit to the fountain. This suggests not panic or distress, but deliberate preparation for a specific task. He moved to stand beside the fountain's edge, gazing down into the clear water where Vincent's body had been discovered. A man does not don comfortable footwear for a midnight confrontation with a black male victim. He does so for careful, methodical work, perhaps the retrieval or concealment of important documents." "The papers from the hidden compartment," Lady Ashworth breathed. Indeed, Vincent had decided to act upon his father's evidence, but first he needed to secure the documents safely. He came to the fountain not for a dramatic confrontation, but for a practical purpose: to remove his father's proof from its hiding place before proceeding with his plans. The architect's burden, Signor Rossini, who had been following this reasoning with growing agitation, suddenly burst forth with desperate confession. "You are correct about the documents, Monsieur Poirot, but you do not understand the full complexity of the situation. Yes, Vincent discovered his father's evidence of financial irregularities, but he also discovered that I had been systematically inflating the fountain's construction costs far beyond our agreed arrangement." The revelation struck the assembled company like a physical blow. Gerald Thornbury's face reflected shock and dawning comprehension. Vincent was not merely an accomplice in embezzlement. Rossini continued, his voice growing stronger as confession provided relief. He was also my victim. I had convinced him that modest overcharges were necessary to ensure quality materials, but in reality I was diverting substantial sums to cover my own debts. When he confronted me 3 weeks ago with his father's correspondence, he demanded immediate repayment of the excess funds. "An impossible demand for a man already in financial difficulty," Poirot observed. "Esatto, I came here hoping to negotiate, to convince him that gradual repayment was more practical than immediate exposure. But Vincent showed no mercy. He gave me 48 hours to produce £15,000 or face criminal charges." The unfinished picture Inspector Morrison moved forward with satisfaction. "Then you killed him to prevent exposure?" "No." Rossini's denial exploded with desperate sincerity. "I argued with him, yes, but when I left the fountain at midnight, Vincent was very much alive, angry, determined, but alive. He was standing at the fountain's edge, holding the documents he had retrieved from the compartment, declaring his intention to take them to the police in the morning." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Yet the compartment was empty when we examined it, and the documents have not been found among Vincent's effects or elsewhere in the house. Most curious, non?" "Then someone else came to the fountain after I departed," Rossini insisted. Someone who knew about the hidden compartment and Vincent's plans. The fountain continued its eternal song as shadows lengthened across the courtyard, and I realized with growing certainty that we had reached only the penultimate movement of this complex symphony. The true revelation still awaited, hidden in the psychological depths that only Poirot's legendary mind could fully fathom. "Indeed," Poirot murmured, his green eyes moving systematically from face to face among the assembled household. Someone who possessed both knowledge and opportunity, and perhaps most importantly, someone who understood that Vincent's death would solve their problems far more permanently than any financial arrangement. The Belgian detective's gaze lingered meaningfully on the French windows of the manor house, where the afternoon light revealed watching faces behind the glass. The game was approaching its climax, but the final card had yet to be played. "Come," Poirot said with sudden decision. "I believe it is time to examine more closely the room from which Vincent emerged on his final journey. For I suspect the answer to this puzzle lies not in what he took to the fountain, but in what he left behind." The fountain's marble figures seemed to watch our departure with knowing eyes, guardians of secrets that would soon yield to the inexorable logic of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. And the drawing-room of Greystone Manor had taken on the atmosphere of a courtroom as evening shadows gathered beyond the French windows. Poirot had requested the entire household to assemble, and they sat in careful arrangement. Lady Ashworth beside the fireplace, Gerald and Vivian Thornbury at opposite ends of the room, Miss Celia twisting her handkerchief, Signor Rossini pacing nervously, and Miss Penelope Marsh clutching her notebook like armor against approaching revelation. Inspector Morrison occupied a chair near the door, his expression suggesting he believed the case already solved. Yet Poirot's manner indicated far greater complexity lay beneath the surface. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty, "we have spent this day examining individual crimes, embezzlement, forgery, blackmail. But I fear we have been observing merely the visible peaks of a far more treacherous mountain range of deception." He moved to stand before the windows, where the fountain's silhouette was visible against the darkening sky. The death of Vincent Ashworth was not an isolated tragedy, but the inevitable culmination of crimes that began 5 years ago with the death of Sir Charles himself. The broader conspiracy. Lady Ashworth's face drained of color. "Charles died of natural causes, a heart attack." "Indeed, madame. But consider the circumstances. Your husband had discovered substantial financial irregularities in the fountain construction accounts, according to his private correspondence, which Vincent eventually found hidden in the fountain's secret compartment. As Sir Charles had scheduled an emergency meeting with the family solicitor for the morning after his death, a meeting that never occurred. Poirot produced Vincent's water-damaged diary. Vincent's final entries reveal his growing conviction that his father's death, while medically natural, was precipitated by extreme emotional distress. A violent confrontation, perhaps. The shock of discovering betrayal by someone he trusted completely. Gerald Thornbury leaned forward, his voice tense. "You're suggesting someone caused Uncle Charles's heart attack deliberately?" "I suggest that extreme emotional trauma can trigger cardiac events in susceptible individuals." Vincent's diary records his methodical investigation into that fatal day. But he discovered that certain documents disappeared from his father's study within hours of the death. Documents that would have exposed the embezzler's identity beyond doubt. The physical evidence. But Vincent was thorough in his investigation, Poirot continued, moving to the center of the room. "This afternoon I examined his chambers more carefully. In the fireplace grate I found fragments of heavy paper, cardstock bearing the family crest. Vincent had burnt something recently, something too dangerous to leave intact." He paused, his gaze moving systematically from face to face. "I also discovered traces of a struggle in his room, a fountain pen broken in haste, ink stains on the carpet, evidence that someone had interrupted his final preparations. Most tellingly, I found this." From his pocket, Then Poirot produced a handkerchief of fine lawn, embroidered with intertwined letters. Monogrammed V.A., Vivian Ashworth, your maiden initials, Madame Thornbury. Found hidden behind the drawing-room curtains, stained with ink from Vincent's broken pen. Vivian's composure finally cracked. "I can explain. Attendez." Poirot raised a delicate hand. "Explanations will come in due course. But first, we must understand the complete scope of the deception that has poisoned this household for 5 years. The psychological web. Vincent's diary reveals a man consumed by guilt, not for his own crimes, but for protecting someone else's. He had discovered the true embezzler's identity shortly after his father's funeral, yet chose to shield them from exposure. Why? Because he was in love with the criminal? Because he feared the scandal would destroy the family? Or because he was being systematically blackmailed into silence? The room had grown completely still except for the fountain's eternal song drifting through the windows. Poirot's green eyes glittered with the light of revelation approaching. The answer, I believe, lies in understanding that Vincent Ashworth was not merely a victim of murder, but the final casualty in a campaign of deception that began the moment Sir Charles discovered the theft of his fountain funds. Someone in this room has been playing a very long game indeed, a game that required Vincent's silence, then his compliance, and finally, his death. He moved toward the French windows, gazing out at the controversial fountain where Vincent had met his fate. Tomorrow morning, I shall reveal not only who killed Vincent Ashworth, but who bears ultimate responsibility for the web of crimes that made his murder inevitable. The fountain has kept its secrets long enough. The marble figures seemed to watch through the gathering darkness, eternal witnesses to the human drama that had played out in their shadow. A drama that would soon reach its final, devastating conclusion. The morning sun cast long shadows across the drawing-room as Poirot positioned himself before the assembled household with the gravity of a judge preparing to deliver sentence. Every face reflected tension. Lady Ashworth pale but composed, Gerald and Vivian Thornbury sitting with careful distance between them, Miss Celia clutching her onyx bracelet, Signor Rossini wringing his hands, and Miss Penelope Marsh trembling visibly in her chair. And Inspector Morrison stood by the door, his notebook ready, while the fountain's eternal song drifted through the French windows like a mocking chorus to the drama about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "We have spent these hours examining individual threads of deception, embezzlement, forgery, blackmail, hidden passions. But now we must weave these threads together to reveal the complete tapestry of murder." He moved to stand before the windows, where the controversial fountain gleamed in the morning light. Vincent Ashworth died not because of a single crime, but because he had finally decided to expose a web of deception that had poisoned this household for 5 years. But his murder was the desperate act of someone who could not bear to face the consequences of their choices. The foundation of guilt. "Let us begin with what we know beyond doubt," Poirot continued, turning back to face the room. The fountain construction accounts were systematically pillaged of nearly £50,000, far more than Signor Rossini's inflated invoices could account for. This required someone with intimate access to estate finances and the ability to create convincing false documentation. His gaze moved methodically across each face. More importantly, this required someone who could manipulate Vincent Ashworth into accepting blame for crimes he did not commit. Why would a man of Vincent's precise nature and moral character agree to such deception? Perhaps only for love, or what he believed to be love. Poirot's eyes settled on Vivian Thornbury, whose composed facade had begun to show hairline cracks. "Madame, you possessed the motive, the opportunity, and most crucially, the psychological leverage over Vincent that made this elaborate deception possible." The web unraveled. "Your gambling debts began shortly after your marriage to Gerald. Poirot continued with relentless precision. Initially modest, they grew increasingly desperate as your losses mounted. You discovered the fountain construction provided the perfect vehicle for embezzlement. Large sums moving through multiple accounts, complex invoicing that could be manipulated, and your husband's trusting nature regarding your involvement in estate finances. Gerald's face reflected dawning horror as the implications became clear. "Ah, Vivian, surely this is impossible." "Is it, monsieur?" Poirot interrupted gently. "Your wife possessed complete access to the financial records through her role in household management. She had observed your business methods sufficiently to forge convincing documentation. Most importantly, she had cultivated Vincent's romantic attachment to ensure his silence when the theft was discovered." Vivian's hands gripped the arms of her chair with white-knuckled intensity, but she maintained her composure. "These are serious accusations, Monsieur Poirot. I trust you have more than speculation to support them." The physical evidence. Poirot smiled with grim satisfaction. "Indeed, madame, let us examine the evidence systematically." He produced the embroidered handkerchief from his pocket. This fine lawn handkerchief, monogrammed with the initials V.A., your maiden initials, Vivian Ashworth, was discovered hidden behind the drawing-room curtains, stained with ink from Vincent's broken fountain pen. "Many women share those initials," Vivian replied, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "True, but this handkerchief bears traces of marble dust, the specific composition of Carrara marble used in the fountain's construction. It was present during the struggle in Vincent's chambers and again at the fountain where the murder occurred." Poirot moved closer to her chair. "More tellingly, your evening gloves show water stains at the cuffs, not from a brief calming visit to the fountain as you claimed, but from the prolonged contact required to hold a struggling man beneath the water until he drowned. The psychological profile. But physical evidence alone does not make a murderer," Poirot continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We must understand the psychology that made this crime inevitable. Vincent's diary reveals a man consumed not by guilt over his own crimes, but by the terrible burden of protecting someone else's secrets. He had discovered your embezzlement shortly after his father's death, yet chose to shield you from exposure." "Why?" Poirot's question hung in the air like smoke. "Because he was infatuated with you, madame. Because you had cultivated his romantic attachment with just enough encouragement to ensure his loyalty, while maintaining the appearance of propriety. Had you made him believe that his silence was chivalrous protection of family honor." Vivian's composure finally began to crack visibly. "Vincent was fond of me, yes, but I never encouraged—" "Did you not?" Poirot's interruption was sharp. "The onyx bracelet he purchased just yesterday, was that not intended as a gift for you? The private conversations in the conservatory that Gerald observed, were those not carefully orchestrated to maintain Vincent's emotional dependence?" The final confrontation. "For 5 years, this arrangement served your purposes," Poirot continued relentlessly. "Vincent bore the shame of apparent embezzlement while you continued to benefit from the stolen funds. But recently, your gambling debts had grown beyond even these resources. You demanded additional payments, threatening to expose Vincent as the true architect of the scheme if he refused. This was your fatal error, madame. Vincent's conscience finally revolted against the deception. He retrieved his father's evidence from the fountain's secret compartment and prepared a complete confession that would expose not only his own complicity, but your role as the primary culprit." Poirot moved to stand directly before Vivian's chair. "Last evening, you received Vincent's summons to meet at the fountain at midnight. He intended to give you one final opportunity for voluntary confession before exposing everything to Gerald and the authorities. But you could not permit this revelation. Not the financial scandal, not the criminal charges, and most certainly not your husband's inevitable contempt." The method revealed. "You arrived at the fountain to find Vincent standing at the basin's edge, holding the documents that would destroy you. When he refused to reconsider, when he insisted that his conscience demanded complete honesty, you struck him from behind with the marble dipper that Signor Rossini had left beside the fountain after his repairs. Poirot's voice grew quieter, more intense. Vincent fell forward into the basin, stunned by the blow, but you knew that a simple head injury might not prove fatal, and you could not risk his survival and testimony. So you held him face down in the shallow water, using his childhood terror of drowning against him, until his struggles ceased. Afterward, you arranged his body to suggest an accidental fall. I retrieved the incriminating documents and returned to the house through the servants' staircase. But in your haste and panic, you made 3 crucial errors. You left your stained handkerchief, you forgot to account for the dry slippers Vincent had worn to the fountain, and you underestimated how many witnesses had observed various aspects of the evening's events. The confession. The room had fallen completely silent, except for the fountain's eternal murmur. Vivian sat frozen, her face cycling through expressions of shock, calculation, and finally, defeat. "He was going to destroy everything," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "Not just me, but Gerald, young Philip, the entire family. For what? For honesty? For the satisfaction of a guilty conscience?" Her composure shattered entirely. Charles would still be alive if he hadn't discovered the missing funds and confronted me that terrible day. His heart attack was brought on by the shock of learning his daughter-in-law was a thief. Vincent would still be alive if he had accepted the necessity of silence. I never wanted anyone to die. I only wanted to survive my foolish mistakes. Gerald stared at his wife with a mixture of horror and heartbreak. "Vivian, how could you live with this deception for so long?" "How could I live without it?" she replied with bitter honesty. "Prison, scandal, losing everything we had built together. It was unthinkable. Vincent understood that, or I thought he did, but his conscience made him weak in the end." Justice served. Inspector Morrison stepped forward with handcuffs, his expression grim but satisfied. "Mrs. Vivian Thornberry, I arrest you for the murder of Vincent Ashworth. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be used in evidence against you." As Morrison led her toward the door, Vivian turned back once toward the French windows, where the marble fountain continued its eternal performance. "It was never worth it," she said quietly. "Not the money, not the lies, not that accursed monument to my own greed." The philosophical conclusion. After the police had departed with their prisoner, Lady Ashworth spoke in a shaken voice. "Monsieur Poirot, how did we fail to see what was happening in our own home?" Poirot gazed thoughtfully at the fountain, where the afternoon sun cast dancing patterns across the marble figures. "We see what we wish to see, madame. Vincent appeared guilty because guilt consumed him, not for his own crimes, but for his complicity in protecting another's. Vivian appeared innocent because she had perfected the art of deception over many years. The truth, it often hides in plain sight, disguised as something more palatable to our sensibilities." "And the fountain?" Gerald asked quietly. "Should it be destroyed?" "That decision is yours to make," Poirot replied. "But consider this. The fountain itself is innocent of all crimes. It is merely stone and water, given meaning by human hands and human hearts. To destroy it would be to forget the lessons it might teach about the dangerous currents that flow beneath even the most beautiful surfaces." The departure. As we prepared to leave Greystone Manor, I walked once more around the controversial fountain that had been the centerpiece of so much tragedy. The water continued its eternal cascade, yet indifferent to the human drama that had played out in its shadow. "Another case closed, Poirot," I observed, though I confess the solution was more complex than I anticipated. "Oui, mon ami," he replied, adjusting his tie with characteristic precision. "The human heart, it is the most complex mechanism of all. We may understand the workings of marble fountains and mechanical cherubs, but the springs of human motivation, These require the most delicate investigation. As our motor car pulled away from the manor, I glanced back at the fountain one final time. It stood serene and beautiful in the afternoon light, a reminder that beneath the most graceful exteriors, dangerous currents may still flow, and that only the most careful observer can detect them before they claim their victims. Hercule Poirot settled into his seat with satisfaction, and already arranging his thoughts with the methodical precision that had once again triumphed over human deception. The secret of the marble fountain had been revealed at last, and justice, though delayed by years of careful deception, had finally been served. The fountain would continue its eternal song, but now it sang not of mystery, but of truth, cold, clear, and inexorable as the marble from which it was carved.